Welcome, everyone, to Reviving a Baroque Oratorio, the Academy of Sacred Drama's first online lecture event. My name is Jeremy Reiser, and I'm the Artistic Director of the Academy. For those who are tuning in from our Give Butter page, thanks a lot already. There's been some generous contributions, and we always appreciate the donations. I hope everyone's safe and healthy and staying at home as much as they need to still. I direct the oratorios at the Academy Revives, and I thought for today's lecture it would be helpful to tell you about the process of getting from the composer's manuscript to the modern premiere of a Baroque oratorio. This journey is something that is obvious to me since I coordinate it, but I understand that from the outside, and even for the musicians who perform our oratorios, that most people are unaware of all the components of this exciting and, I have to say, oftentimes exhausting journey. Today, I'm going to focus on our process for the revival of Antonio Giannattini's La Vittima d'Amore, ossia La Morte di Cristo, from 1690, that we presented early this year in a performance that we called The Victim of Love. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that at any time during the course of this lecture, you can ask me questions on our Discord channel. If you're watching this lecture on our Give Butter page, scroll down to Story to access that link. And if you're watching on YouTube, there's a link in the description. If you don't already have a Discord account, you'll be asked for your name, whether that's a nickname or your real name, whatever you'd like, your email, and a password. And it's pretty easy to set up. But by registering, you agree to Discord's terms of service and their privacy policy, so you might want to take a look at that before you do. The great thing about using Discord for our purposes is that your account won't expire once this presentation is over. Anytime you have a question for the Academy or you want to chat with other lovers of the sacred drama genre, you're free to log back in and start typing. Unlike a Zoom conference, this is an online room that you can visit anytime you want to chat or ask questions about sacred drama. We're also updating our Discord with announcements for our next events, such as my recital coming up later this month, and listening recommendations. We have a Spotify list on Discord right now of sacred drama if you want to take a look. And over the course of this, I'll be checking your questions on my iPad, and I'll answer them when there's a good opportunity. And near the end, there will also be a dedicated time to ask questions. So feel free, make that account as I'm talking, and we'll run through our slides and learn some more about reviving a Baroque oratorio. So let's begin with the basics. What is sacred drama? Sacred drama is a genre of human expression that has been part of most, if not all, cultures. In ancient times, it could be found in the ritual dramas of Slavic peoples, Sanskrit theater, the rituals of pre-Islamic Persia, as well as the everyday life of pre-colonial Africa. At the core of sacred drama is the ability to communicate an innate sense of belief, tradition, and identity in a performative way. When we're talking about the performative here, we're talking about outward expression rather than private or internalized expression. As a public event, sacred drama synthesized people's sense of belief and identity. In its more institutionalized form, sacred drama in ancient Greek was synonymous with their theater, where tragedy served the role of giving the Greek people a sense of place within the vast cosmos. So let's skip ahead. What is oratorio? During the Baroque era, and this is a period of time that we usually understand to span from the beginning of the 17th century to the middle of the 18th century, and of course many, many centuries after the staging of Greek theater, there was an effort to revive the theatrical tradition of the ancient Greeks. The result was a new form of drama that came to be known by two names, opera and oratorio. These two genres related in their intention, in their aesthetic, and in their construction through the use of musical movements that were more song-like, that we call arias. And arias were then coupled with movements with lots of declaimed text set to music, and this is what we call recitative. Opera, which we generally categorize as secular, used costumes, elaborate stagings, and entire theaters that were specially built for its performances. On the other hand, oratorio, which we generally consider as a sacred drama, took place in prayer houses, or they're also known as oratories. So think oratorio, oratories, churches, and sometimes palaces. Oratorio performances generally rejected elaborate stagings and the machinery of the theater. However, like opera, its sister genre, the oratorio embraced the use of classical references to the Greeks to vividly communicate stories from the Judeo-Christian tradition. We have sirens outside, sorry about that. Musicologists like the great Howard Smither, who's a champion for the revival of sacred drama in our time, has a more in-depth definition of oratorio and also categorizes other Baroque sacred drama categories such as passions, history, and sepulchre, but we'll save those for another time. If you want to do some further reading, you might want to check out his A History of the Oratorio book series. This is a 4-book series. I thought we'd start by talking about places to start looking for these forgotten materials. In my own journey, I started with Smither's seminal work. I poked around libraries in person and online, and I checked out digitized works on IMSLP for scores. I also looked at Carago, which has a collection of digitized Italian libretti, and I explored the RISM database and also the fabulous world of Oxford Music Online. Howard Smither's 4-volume A History of the Oratorio is generally a great place to start an exploration of oratorio. He defines the genre, systematically lays out a historical context for oratorio in various times and places, and he offers a more in-depth look at various composers and librettists. It's not a cheap set, but it can be accessed at many major libraries. Now, some of the world's great libraries own manuscripts of oratorios, penned either by the composer or a copyist. Many of the largest institutions, from the Austrian National Library to the Beinecke Rare Books and Manuscript Library at Yale to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, offer digitized versions of many of their valuable manuscripts. Depending on the library, it is also possible to access editions of sacred drama. Now, I have to say here, because sacred drama is a generally unknown, less researched category of music history, there's a lot of oratorios that have not been digitized. So we only get a sliver of what's available in even these great libraries that have been digitizing many of their works. IMSLP is also an incredible source for finding these digitized materials, because many of the works digitized by libraries end up on IMSLP. I say most because it's very much a many and not an all situation. Active members of the community add things to IMSLP as they find the digitized things on library sites. And RISM is a nonprofit organization that aims to comprehensively document extant musical sources anywhere in the world. And their database offers the most comprehensive documentation available for music manuscripts and also printed music between 1600 and 1800. And it continues to grow through monthly updates, and it averages about 30,000 new records annually, which is quite a number. And finally, Oxford Music Online offers a works list with every composer entry. The works list will state the location of a manuscript if it's known. And reading about composers offers some insight into the family tree of a composer's teachers and work locations. It's a great way to find related materials from where you start looking. While you're looking for an oratorio, it's important to consider that great art and music doesn't come out of a vacuum. There is always, and I say always, a lineage of influence that can be followed through composers, librettists, and within geographic locations. So keep that in mind as a starting point for looking for materials. Also, depending on the work, there might be scores and/or parts available. Typically, the oratorios that I have been working with have only had 1 or 2 accessible manuscript scores and no parts available. I found anyways that many 18th century oratorios have both scores and parts available, while some early works only exist in parts. Sometimes libretti have a different name than the title of the score, and sometimes libretti are the basis for multiple scores. So for multiple musical works, the composer might have drawn from the same librettist in the same work. Many oratorios were modified for different performances as well, so it's often necessary to do some detective work to find the libretto that corresponds to the score being used. And finally, you just need to have a strategy to find what you're looking for. Scores end up in a location oftentimes because a composer lived or traveled in a certain area, and sometimes scores were sent to a court as a type of business card or a resume showing off the prowess of a composer. Libretti are usually found where an oratorio was performed by and large. And of course, sometimes oratorios and even libretti end up in a collection of someone who's interested in that and has bought them at auction or in a store. When I led my first oratorio performance, I was at the end of my final year in Juilliard's historical performance program. The oratorio we did was suggested to me by the program's director, Robert Mealy, and the piece that we performed was a great place for me to start my journey into the world of sacred drama. We performed a Latin language oratorio, or actually a historia, by the French composer Marc-Antoine Charpentier, and it was only about 40 minutes long. It already had an edition, and I believe that Charlie Weaver, the theorbo player and Juilliard professor, made an English translation for our performance. This was an example of a relatively rare one-part oratorio. Maybe not rare for France, but rare in the general scheme of oratorios. Sermons were common between halves of 2-part oratorios in prayer houses and churches. And later, when oratorio became a fashionable undertaking of the wealthy and performances occurred in palaces, receptions sometimes replaced sermons. We also have information about practices that revolved around later sacred drama. Bach Passions, for example, as lengthy as they already are, had long sermons in between musical halves. Handel, on the other hand, often put organ or even violin concerti between parts of his 3-part oratorios. For some reason, the historically informed performance movement that aimed to resurrect the playing and singing practices of the Baroque never managed to make serious progress in reviving the format in which works were performed. In the case of the oratorio, there's a serious loss when a sermon, a socially significant reception, or even more instrumental music, as in the case of Handel, is omitted. I believe that the systematic defiance against the spirit in which these works were written is one of the root causes for sacred drama's absence from the consciousness of the average and even highly educated listener. Now, there are other cases when the oratorio isn't considered the only important pillar of the performance, but instead the work belongs to a larger religious service. An example of this is Antonio Draghi's Oratorio di Giuditta from 1668, which the Academy reconstructed for performances in 2018. We followed the order of oratorio services at the court of the Empress Dowager Eleonora Gonzaga, including a sermon, in our case a contextual lecture, a litany, and ended with the Stabat Mater and procession. So these are other liturgical elements that were cornerstones of how this oratorio service was constructed. I would like to now show you a short clip of that performance. It's about 3.5 minutes long. The singers that you just heard are Fiona Gillespie as Judita, Sarah McKimmey as Abra, and Padraic Costello as Testo. Judith, or Judita, refuses to surrender against the overwhelming forces of the enemy. What you see transpire is her transformation at the hands of Abra into her finery to go woo and eventually decapitate the enemy. The short story of Judith, told in Draghi's oratorio, is the largest component of our Lenten religious service. When we're putting these editions together, one of the, whether that's the Draghi or Giannattini's La Vittima d'Amore, our focus for today, is making the performing edition. And that's a lengthy process, and much of what we do is made with free open license software. Leili Zhang is usually responsible for inputting all the notes of an oratorio into MuseScore, the open license program that we use to make our editions. I'm not positive how many hours this takes him, but it's dozens of hours over many months. One of the tricky parts about this stage is entering in missing accidentals, sharps or flats, and figuring out if a sharp is part of the figured bass or if it corresponds to a note. After his initial and significant contribution, I go through line by line from the bass up and edit all the notes. I then input the words from the manuscript, cross-referencing them with the libretto. And now sometimes there are discrepancies between the score and the libretto, and then I have to make a decision about what will ultimately end up in the edition. Usually we focus mostly on what's happening in the score and allow changes only in an extremely mild way from the libretto, but it depends on how hard the score is to read and what extra information we actually find in the libretto. So I thought I'd show you for just a second what Muse score looks like. In the middle, obviously, we have our notes, and on the top, we have the different note lengths. On the left-hand side of the page, you can enter things like clefs, key signatures, time signatures, ornaments, things like that. And the right-hand side is what they call the inspector, and it means you can take an individual element on the page and you can edit it in whatever way you need to, including make it invisible if I've put in something like a tempo marking that I don't want to have appear in the final score. I then format the addition of the score to make page turns as easy and least disruptive as possible. And believe me, it's a difficult task when the music never really stops for 20 minutes at a time. After the score is created, I prepare a continuo part for our bowed bass, and that's usually Arnie Tanimoto, who's playing viola da gamba or cello. Arnie will want as much text as possible, but it's harder for him to make a quick page turn than it is for a keyboard player, so I usually have to make choices about where to cut text. I also put his part on a legal size paper, so there are still fewer page turns. The other instrumental parts come next, and I now make parts that include the continue line and the text when necessary. Especially with tight rehearsal timelines, it's important that the instrumentalists are comfortable with their entrances and know every time when they need to come in and what material their part has actually grown out of. My part of the process at this point has taken me more than 100 extremely focused and intense hours for a 2-hour oratorio. At the time of this presentation, this is all unpaid volunteer labor, and we're hoping to reverse that trend. So if you're able, join the other people that already did on our Give Butter page where we're streaming, or to donate, or on our website at sacreddrama.org/donate. We really appreciate whatever you can give. Now, after all this work, I print the scores, parts, and translations, and I have thankfully anyways, have a great laser printer at home that's get them printed cleanly and also fast. And when you're dealing with hundreds of pages at once, you need some speed to your printer. I then take them to the print shop to get them spire bound with a clear front and a black back. The people at the print shop usually know why I'm there at this point. And having a score that's as professional, easy to use, and error-free is an important step towards having an efficient rehearsal process. And especially with tight timelines, this is a must for excellent performances. Thought I'd show you very quickly the different scores. You can see the score is the same size as the parts, and except for the bowed continuo part, which is on the legal size page. Everything is bound, everything's easy to use, clean, and ready to go. I mentioned including the English translation of the text with printed scores. This allows the singers and continuo team to make sure they understand what's happening at every moment as they work the music up to a performable standard. A translation can go in two major directions, more literal or more meaning-based poetry. This is a difficult wall to straddle when translating an oratorio because the translation is designed in part to make sure singers can understand every word. However, beautiful language that really gets the meaning of the text across is, of course, extremely desirable. So when finding a translator, we want to find someone that can successfully rise to this task, and that's difficult. But we've worked with good people, such as Lucy Yates, Charlie Weaver, Elizabeth Pace, Margaretti. Thank you to all of you. All of them are musicians, and so understand what's at stake for the performing musician, while at the same time, they usually manage to clearly communicate the meaning of a text. Along with talking about the preparations for other musicians, I thought I'd talk a little bit about my personal preparations. Because I'm not a native speaker of either modern Italian or especially the archaic variants in use in many of the oratorio scores, I begin to learn the score by writing in the translation phrase by phrase and modifying it when necessary to clarify passages that I'm still unclear about. I also make sure to write in explanations of all of the classical or biblical references, whether I'm familiar with them or not, so that I have thoroughly thought about the stories and their usage within the libretto. This also enables me to have a clear and ready explanation for obscure references for the musicians during the rehearsal process. I then go back through the score, dividing long chunks of recitative into their logical structural components, usually just putting a line across different sections. I begin to map out possibilities for textual changes in the continuo team. As someone who doesn't play a continuo instrument myself, I rely upon our knowledgeable team to figure out how to execute the overall structural and textual decisions that I make. And I found that this is a successful collaboration, and I'm very happy to work with the people that I do. I also spend time identifying the emotional shifting points in arias, and I make preliminary decisions about tempi. Oh, and I practice my violin part too. I don't want to forget that. I also practice some of the continuo lines, voice parts, and instrumental parts on my violin. So to get a clear idea about what everyone's dealing with. At this point, I need to clarify that my preparation isn't perfect. I cut corners and not every movement is equally prepared. I'm often busy and only so much can be done. However, my philosophy is that a great performance will be made possible by layers of unseen preparation that can make or break a rehearsal process and subsequently a performance. Thought I'd show you just an example of a page of my score. I have the written in translation. I have markings for volume level, intensity, and also instrument playing in the continuo line. And then I also have check marks for places to go back to. So I didn't mention this before, but of course the score gets marked up with rehearsal notes as we're going along. I need to be able to have a marker for where to go back to as I'm cataloging changes in my head. To prepare for our past season, I went with our singers and continuo team to Avaloq Farm Music Institute to begin to make our way through the music and start to add movement to our productions. A classically trained mind, Tony Lepresti, joined our team as the movement director, and we spent our time at Avaloq split between movement workshops that everyone participated in, even the instrumentalists, and music rehearsals. We also had time to relax, and the kitchen at Avaloq prepared some pretty great food. If you've ever been to Avaloq Farm, you know what great meals they have. Tony worked with us on warm-up exercises and breaking apart the components of music. Of movement. He gave the singers tools to be able to spontaneously express the emotion and intention of what they were singing. And he also started to formulate the overall movement framework for our two major performances. So in September, I believe, or maybe November, we did The Man at the Crossroads, another Giannottini oratorio. And that has a lot of moving around on stage and vivid contrasts. So the singers switch between an individual character to choruses of angels or passions or demons. It was fun at the same time. It was emotionally powerful. The Victim of Love, on the other hand, depicts the lead up to Jesus' death on the cross. The singers were kept in tableau, standing for the entire performance. It took a lot of discipline and effort, and the result was something visually powerful in a very different way. Some audience members described it as a Renaissance painting coming alive. And I think that's a very attractive image. Adding movement was a major step for us. It required a lot of the singers, and there was a learning curve for each of us. However, the result was something that was able to move our audience to goosebumps and even to gasp and cry. These are the reports that we got after performances. This is the level of emotional movement that I was striving for. This is how a great story is effectively communicated through music. In the near future, we're exploring the possibility of adding projection to performances to add another visual layer, and eventually adding costumes for singers and fashionable uniforms for the instrumentalists will add another layer of visual excellence and hopefully continue to strengthen the emotional impact of what we're doing. I want to show you briefly in the slide. On the left-hand side, we have the three singers in tableau. And notice their arms and their wrists. Nothing is in a straight line. Everything's always curved. And on the right-hand side, we have Andrew with his arms stretched outwards. And it's like he's on the cross. And for the audience, during the oratorio, that especially during the second half when he had his arms raised for much of the time, it had the feeling that they were always raised. And I think the emotional feeling that came from that was quite powerful. Before I move on, I'm noticing that on our Discord channel we have from DRB SHC, what's a libretto and how does it differ from a score? So a libretto is just the words. So when an oratorio was put on, in many cases there was a booklet that was printed that was an oratorio booklet. There was no music in it. It was just the words of the libretto. And people would usually buy this and keep a copy for themselves, bring it home so that they could always remember that libretto. A score has both the music and the words in it, and it's usually handwritten and not printed like a libretto will come from a print shop. It's produced in a run. Many, maybe hundreds of librettos would be printed at once, but a score is handwritten and is very painstaking, and there will usually be less scores available than there are librettos by a significant portion. One of the most stressful and unproductive parts of putting on concerts for the Academy is dealing with keyboard instruments, so harpsichords or organ. We don't own either, and it can be expensive to rent them. When we're able to get low-cost rentals, coordinating transportation has turned into a time-consuming and oftentimes logistical nightmare. To make this more manageable, I have started to create a separate instrument moving schedule that coordinates movement of instruments between location and specifies the people involved. And I have to say, I'm usually one of the people involved. If anyone who's watching wants to get us a harpsichord and an organ, it would change my life. So do keep that in mind. We also have to accommodate the time constraints and logistical considerations of our venues. We have been blessed to be in residence at Calvary St. George's Church in New York City, which has enabled us to have free rehearsal space in many circumstances. We have also had the support of other parishes that have offered low-cost or discount rentals, such as the parish of St. Vincent Ferrer on the Upper East Side in New York City and White Plains Presbyterian Church in White Plains. For the actual rehearsal process, I create a schedule that is first broken down into major rehearsal chunks with adequate breaks. Those chunks are further broken down into 5 to 20-minute segments. I estimate how much time something will take to rehearse by considering the length of the music and whether or not there are technically or musically problematic sections, and whether or not similar sections in other oratorios has taken extra time. This is where having performed a bunch of oratorios gives you some real perspective. It's not an exact science, though, and major problems have popped up in the past, like singers getting sick. However, this breakdown of the schedule allows me to dismiss musicians who aren't needed at a certain time, and it helps me to maintain a pace to the schedule. With a still limited budget, we are usually working under significant time constraints, so it's extremely important to not waste time. Every time we're working on a section, I pay attention to what we're doing to determine when to move on next when the music stops, and whether there's a correction in what we're doing. At the same time, I'm making sure that a singer is ready to begin rehearsal on their movements. So as music is being played and rehearsed at one moment, I'm making sure other people are ready to come to stage at a moment's notice. And I'm prepared to move on to the next movement in the rehearsal schedule. Making use of every minute for days on end requires a lot of concentration. And I think I lose weight every time we rehearse an oratorio. Also, not everyone will have the same level of concentration in a rehearsal, so it is also my job to keep an eye on energy and attention levels and nudge where necessary. Adding movement this season added another layer to rehearsals. Tony would sometimes work with a singer when I was rehearsing with someone else. Also, later in the week, when we had gotten through all the music, Tony took over and we did large parts of the oratorio with movement in mind. He would discuss what was coming up with the singers, make changes as we went along, and when we had time, reviewed what happened after we made our way through a section. We will need more time for movement rehearsal in future seasons, and that will expand the possibilities of what we can do with movement. Right now, we usually do everything in a week, with around 3 days of rehearsal and 2 days of performances. We managed to pull off as much as we did this past year because we went on a retreat. But in the future, we're going to need at least a full rehearsal week of rehearsals and a second week for 4 performances. We're planning on splitting those between different locations. We're hoping to grow the Academy beyond New York City to places in Westchester County, up the Hudson River, in Western Connecticut, and perhaps somewhere else in New York State. So just to show you very briefly, this is an example of my rehearsal schedule. We have large rehearsal chunks in the bold. The breaks are clearly marked, and then within each rehearsal chunk, we have the breakdown of what we're doing. Also, I start each day with the location and the address and make it clear when tuning times are. On the day of a performance, how logistics are handled can make everyone feel secure and ready to do their best, or insecure, rushed, and stressed. And believe me, there's a big difference between the two, and I'm sure my performers can say the same in both circumstances, because some circumstances are always unforeseen. Travel needs to be coordinated in advance with clear expectations for everyone involved. If there's a limited amount of time, food should also be provided so musicians can think about getting ready for the performance and not rushing to get dressed or to a restaurant and back. We have had our fair share of logistical challenges on performance days, but we really try to optimize what we do over time and learn from what otherwise are unforeseen circumstances. We start our oratorios during a performance without a grand entrance of the singers and applause, as if we were starting a religious service or a community gathering rather than a concert. An oratorio service or performance has a different context from a concert, and we make that clear from the beginning. When doing 2-part oratorios, we put a sermon or contextual lecture between halves to honor the intentions of the composer. And in making the actual music, I trust everyone to do their best and to take initiative on doing what they do best. That is something communicated by body language and through musical communication. I think trust between performers is the final necessary ingredient for great music making. The other thing that I'd like to add is that our performances are usually coordinated by volunteers, both people who bring reception food and drink, people who work at the front end, the desk, sell tickets, welcome people inside, usher, pass out programs. And I'd like to take a moment to thank them for all they do to make our performances happen, and also to make people who come in who might not have experienced an Academy performance before feel welcome. And if people don't feel welcome in an oratorio environment where we're dealing with these sacred and ancient stories, then there's really no reason to do it. So thank you so much for the people who have done that. Now I've said too much, so let me show some of the fruit of our labor with a video excerpt of The Victim of Love. It's about 5 minutes long, and when we finish it, we'll wrap up with questions. So please think about submitting a question on Discord now if you have something to ask. Remember, the link is on GiftButter in the story section and in YouTube in the descriptions to be able to join. It's pretty easy, only a few steps. So this is a video excerpt of The Victim of Love.
Anzi temo la morte e sol pavento
That was Andrew Leslie Cooper playing the role of Christ and saying, "Leave me in life, pitiless sorrow, kill me not, for yet a greater pain save me." What a concept. It's incredibly powerful. It's a real jewel of the Baroque. And yet almost no one alive has heard it. If you're listening now, you're one of the very few. And what a shame that this music doesn't exist more freely in our world for more people to listen to. While this video was going on, I saw that we had a bad handle joke from Ryan on the YouTube channel, and we also had lots of people or a number of people contribute quite generously on the Give Butter page. So thank you so much. I really appreciate the donations and all that everybody is doing. Thank you. So I have our first question, and remember, questions are from the Discord channel. So please click the link and ask questions through the Discord channel. From Ray Leave, how do you bring out the emotion from the lines in a cold manuscript? Trying to figure out what a composer means when he's written these notes on a page is the bread and butter of what's happening when we're reviving an oratorio. Lots of people can say, "Oh yes, that piece of music is very good. I've heard a great recording of it." Or yes, I saw this performed live by this ensemble. And in the case of the Academy of Sacred Drama, a lot of what we do is stuff that hasn't ever been heard before. There's no recording, there's no addition, there's no translation. We're making everything from scratch. So we have to figure out, what does the composer mean at this point? And one of the ways of figuring this out is to do a lot of them. And that's why the Academy of Sacred Drama is in a special position, because we're one of the few organizations in the world that has devoted the majority of our time to reviving Baroque oratorio. And so we've done a lot of either American or modern day premieres of oratorios, and we've got to figure out what the issues are. And they sort of, you find the same issues across scores. But another thing to consider is how I approach the scores by taking everything in the smallest chunk. I first take a large movement, divide it into large chunks, divide the large chunks into smaller chunks, and the small chunks into individual gestures. And what a group of notes can effectively do emotionally isn't infinite. There's not a million ways to be able to play one phrase. There's many ways to play a phrase poorly, but if you're going to play a phrase effectively, there's usually a few possibilities. And then those possibilities are reduced even further by what those set of notes are next to. They inform the possibilities of what you can do with those notes. So when I'm trying to figure out how to emotionally grapple with a line that hasn't been heard before, so I'm thinking about things like tempo, intention of the notes. Does this feel more like something that's watery or airy with lots of bubbles, or does it feel very earthy, that I'm bouncing down on a hard earth and I feel something solid? There's a number of different textures to music that are a possibility at any point. And so the words help inform that, the sets of notes in relationship to each other help inform that, and at the end of the day, you do what seems right. But there is for me, a hierarchical way of going about finding emotion. We have another question from DRB SHC, and that's, how do you select an oratorio to revive? And that's a difficult question. Partially what I do is I construct seasons for the Academy, which right now are based on either a composer or a concept. And so if it's the case of a composer, I'll find a work that's particularly good that I know already exists, and I know that the high quality work is already there, and then I'll have more faith that what I'm about to do is good. But I also run through these pieces in my head before I do them. I take lines in both the bass line and the vocal lines and the violin line because because I'm a violinist, and figure out how this might all work. Like for example, this past year we had a year of Giannettini. How did we find Giannettini in the first place? The year before, I had done some research, and I had been reading about a magnificent series of Moses oratorios. So it was a cycle of Moses' life, all written by different composers, and the librettist was the same person who found the composers and got the court in Modena to actually pay for the performances. And the by far the best one that we did that year was an oratorio by Antonio Giannettini, and it was obviously the kind of work that deserves to be listened to. So I decided to devote an entire season to it this year, and we got to find 2 more extremely good oratorios to revive for today. Now we only have 1 more to go. We have an earlier oratorio from Giannettini that will approach in future years at some point. I'm not sure when, but the edition is already being made. I have to say it's a little bit tricky to figure out what should be revived or not. You can't always tell exactly how an oratorio is going to work out until you're in the midst of an edition and figuring out how the notes are all working together. You might start to find flaws or problems. I'd say we've been generally pretty lucky, and a lot of what we have done, I think, is very high quality music, and some things have been just moderately high quality and has its flaws. But this is part of the adventure, to be able to find things that have never been heard before, to take that risk, which I think is really worth doing, and then to make this music alive once again. All right, so I'm pretty sure that's the end of our questions for right now. Is that true? Yes. So what's next? I would like to end by saying that the Academy of Sacred Drama, we have figured out how to craft powerful performances with relatively very little financial support. As exciting as this has been for us to make all the progress that we have over the past few years, I have to tell you that there's a significant human toll for doing a lot with a little. It's not sustainable in the long run. So we've added members to our board, we're preparing to apply for grants, and we're seeking donations to make what we do sustainable and consistently excellent. We invite you to spread the word. If you're watching from YouTube, please subscribe to our channel. If you heard about us through Facebook, please like us on Facebook. You can also go to sacreddrama.org to sign up for our mailing list. That's easy to do and doesn't cost anything, but it helps us to spread the news about our work. If you'd like to go the extra mile, please join the other people who have made donations today on our Give Butter page or on our website, or become a member. Help us to meet the spiritual needs of today through the revival of an ancient art form. We're grateful for your support. And join us in 2 weeks for my violin recital. It features Italian music with all the associated emotional extremes. I'm really looking forward to sharing that music with you. I'm noticing that there are a couple more questions in our Discord chat, and I will answer them after this presentation. So if you need to go now, this is the end of the presentation. For those of you who would like to stay a bit longer, I'm going to stream the final 15 minutes of The Victim of Love, the entire segment. So I'll be signing off, but feel free to send me more questions over Discord. Thanks so much for joining me, and have a good night.
Fu sol cagione, amore. di filio invece cede od dona, e mio fido, a te mio fido, cede la propria madre. Perché mi lasci, perché mi lasci in sì gran volgo, o Inculti incessanti, a moti palpitanti ed interrotti,